Section 6 kicks off a two-part affair whereby we get into the details around import drayage services fee structures. We'll hit a bunch of them in this section, and then we will continue on in a second section that wraps up all of the different fees. We break them up in this way because we want to be sure to dedicate enough time to each fee without extending the length of a single section. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but whereas drayage is definitely an easily identifiable service, the complexities of the operation and the multiple players involved can create misunderstandings when services are billed out. There can be misunderstandings operationally around drayage, which turn into misunderstandings when the fees and services get billed out. Second bullet, given the above, it is really important for all parties to be aware of and understand all potential charges associated with a drayage service. Negotiated up front, explained up front, acronyms spelled out, all of those things. Because without sounding like that famous broken record, drayage can get really, really expensive. The following slides provide a breakdown and explanation of those potential charges. The first one, of course, is going to be the core drayage service, the actual transportation off of a terminal to a BCO's facility, to a railhead, etc. The drayman's core service. This is the charge for pickup of an import container and return of an empty. This second part of the sentence, the return of an empty, is pretty important stuff. The pricing for drayage service is normally quoted on a round-trip basis. When we as an importer are bringing in multiple containers and we have to coordinate the return of those containers, we always want an empty going back to a terminal when our provider is picking up a full. That way, we avoid some of the other charges that we'll be talking about in just a few minutes. Second, fuel surcharge, really critical. FSC, as it's called, is related to the drayage transportation service, but it is in addition to the base drayage charge. That's just a nice way of saying it's extra. So if we're quoted $300 for drayage, we're not finished yet in terms of the charges. The fuel is going to be on top of that. As we note moving on, fuel surcharges are determined by the motor carriers, the dray people themselves, but are based on diesel fuel price information provided by the U.S. Department of Energy. We're going to stop and take a look at how that actually works, because it can be a substantial charge. This is a sample fee explanation of fuel surcharge and how it actually functions. The first thing we'll say is that fuel surcharge is expressed as a percentage of what is referred to as the linehaul charge. Linehaul here is a little bit misleading because that portrays a scenario where truck transportation is going to be a little bit longer. But the same principle applies. The line haul here, albeit a short line haul, is from the port terminal to the drayage destination. With that said, fuel surcharge is expressed as a percentage of the base drayage fee. We'll talk more about that in a second, but it is important to get that out there. The cost per gallon will be calculated by using the Energy Information Administration of the Department of Energy National Average Cost of Fuel on the first working day of each week, and any changes in the fuel surcharge will become effective Friday of the same week. This is an actual fuel surcharge quotation, if you will, from a carrier, but it's based on this table provided by the Department of Energy. It is also important to note that although the charges are based on the information provided by the Department of Energy, these percentages are actually negotiable with your drayage people and with your full truckload people as well, because fuel surcharge applies to domestic trucking also. We'll talk about that later as well. We'll just say for now that these percentages are negotiable. Continuing on, the amount of the fuel surcharge will be as depicted in the table below. Let's look on the left-hand side where it says fuel price per gallon. This is the table provided by the Department of Energy, which is to say, if we look at line 53, if the price per gallon of diesel in the U.S. is between $2.90 and call it $2.95 per gallon. For over-the-road moves, which really doesn't apply to drayage, the additional fuel surcharge is going to be 38 cents per mile. That's for longer haul transportation. On the right-hand side, the last column is where the percentage appears. And we see for line 53 that that percentage is 20.8%. Call it 21%. For drayage purposes, let's say that the core drayage service is $300. For ease of calculation, let's say that the fuel surcharge, based on the price of diesel, is at 20%. That would imply an additional $60 onto the $300 charge. Believe it or not, sometimes importers, BCOs, don't realize that. They think they're paying $300 for a dray, and they end up paying $360, and probably more than that based on some of the other charges that we'll be talking about in just a moment. For now, we're talking about fuel surcharge as a percentage of the core dray service. We'll also talk about fuel surcharge for longer haul full truckload. That's why there's a middle column here that is expressed on a per mile basis and also expressed on a line haul basis, as we saw on the right-hand side. The whole story here is that drayage is subject to fuel surcharge for sure. We as the importer need to be aware of that, number one, and how much it is, number two. It can get really quite expensive. Fuel surcharge is a big deal. Let's move on with our fee structure and talk about chassis usage, which we've mentioned a couple times in prior sections. Let's talk about it some more. Chassis usage is the per day fee charged for use of a chassis. As we've said previously, chassis fees are separate from drayage charges and begin accruing immediately. One mistake that importers sometimes make is related to free time on chassis usage. Most ocean contracts, be they directly with a steamship line or through an NVOCC, will include a certain amount of free time for the container. That's very true. Maybe 14 days, 15 days, it depends on what the importer negotiates. The mistake that gets made is that importers sometimes think that that free time applies to the chassis as well. Typically, and everything's subject to negotiation, one can suppose, but in the case of chassis, typically there is no free time. That chassis usage fee starts right away, as in when the container gets pulled off of the terminal. How much is it going to be? That depends on the market, the port, etc. Detention. Detention gets thrown around a lot in the ocean transportation world, and certainly in the drayage world. And depending on the port, it might have a slightly different meaning. So we'll qualify what we're talking about by saying that right now. Typically, detention fees can apply to both ocean containers and chassis, although those charges may have separate names. Detention is levied when a container and or chassis is not returned to a terminal in a timely fashion. Sometimes 3 days on an ocean container, sometimes 15. It depends on what you negotiate. But there's zero free time on chassis. And sometimes when chassis are really scarce in a port complex, the charges on detention, as we'll discuss in a couple of minutes, can be progressive, meaning that it might be $25 a day for the first 3 days, and then after that, it goes up to $50 a day for maybe the next 4 days, and beyond that, it's $75. We have to pay attention. Detention applies especially to ocean containers when an importer doesn't return an empty in a timely fashion, but can also apply to chassis. It depends on the port, the trade, etc. Per diem. Here's another term that gets bounced around a lot and might have different meanings in different ports. Sometimes, emphasis on sometimes, per diem is considered synonymous with detention, but per diem is a charge for chassis usage, ocean containers, and or 53-foot truck trailers. Per diem, it means daily, basically, and these fees are assessed on that daily basis, and as we said a moment ago, can progressively increase as time goes by. One charge for 0 to 3 days, a higher charge for 3 to 7, etc. The point being here, everybody needs to be aware of per diem charges. They need to be expressed explicitly on a quotation from a drayage provider to an importer, and should be negotiated in advance of utilizing any type of transportation service. As you can see on this slide, The definition's a pretty long one. As such, and as we said at the front end of this section, we're going to stop here and come back and wrap up all of our definitions and explanation of fee structures in the subsequent section. We want to be comprehensive, but we don't want to make one section so long that it becomes onerous for you, the student. Come back and we'll wrap up the whole fee structure on import drayage services.